It was a quiet evening when Beryl Whittaker first shared her story with me. She sat across the table, her hands clasped together, weathered and strong from decades of life. The light from the lamp above us cast gentle shadows on her face, highlighting the deep lines around her eyes, lines not just of age, but of experience. There was a quiet strength about her, but also a vulnerability, as though she were peeling back the layers of her soul for the first time. "Do you really want to hear this?" she asked, her voice steady but tinged with hesitation. "It's not a pleasant story. It's raw, ugly, even, but I'll tell it because people need to know what I saw." I nodded, leaning forward slightly, sensing the weight of her words before they even came. "And so," Beryl began, "if you believe in God and near-death experiences, subscribe to Life at NDE today. Discover inspiring messages from God through powerful near-death stories that bring hope and understanding. Hit subscribe now and join us in spreading the light of faith." My name is Beryl Whittaker. I'm 69 years old, and I live in Mississippi. What I'm about to tell you is something I never thought I'd experience, much less survive to speak about. It's not a story of heroism or triumph. It's a story of reckoning my reckoning. 2 months ago, on October 12th, I was driving back home after running errands in town. The day was ordinary, at least at first. The sky was overcast, the kind of gray that makes you wonder if it'll rain. But it never does. A cool breeze rolled through the air, and the old country song playing on the radio matched the mood perfectly. I don't remember the name of the song, but that melody, it's etched in my memory like a haunting echo. The road home was quiet, almost too quiet. No cars, no people, just the glossy sheen of the pavement stretching ahead. As I approached the intersection, I glanced left and right out of habit, not expecting anything. Everything seemed still. That's when I heard it, a low hum, faint but growing louder. I turned my head sharply to the left, and that's when I saw it. An old, battered yellow Mustang was hurtling toward me. The headlights were on, glaring like twin suns. I barely had time to register the rust on its grille or the cracked glass of its headlights before the world erupted around me. The engine's growl turned into a deafening roar. Time slowed, and for one agonizing moment, I saw the driver's hands gripping the wheel tightly. Then came the screech of brakes and the sound of metal crashing into metal. The impact threw me to the side. I felt weightless, like a rag doll caught in a storm. My car flipped. Once, twice, I lost count. I wanted to scream, but the sound stuck in my throat. Then, silence. Absolute silence. The kind that makes your ears ring and your heart pound in terror. My eyes were closed when I felt my body hit the asphalt. Cold and unforgiving. And then, nothing. Just an overwhelming void. It wasn't darkness, it was emptiness. A stillness that swallowed me whole. When the next sensation came, it wasn't one I could explain. A burst of white light pierced through the void, blindingly bright, like staring directly at the sun. I tried to shield my eyes, but I couldn't move. My arms, my legs, everything was frozen, as if I were suspended in midair. The light flashed again, and again, each burst accompanied by a low, resonating hum that vibrated deep within me. I didn't know if I was breathing or if my heart was still beating. All I knew was the light and the sound, pulsing through me like a strange rhythm. As the flashes continued, they began to take shape. At first, it was abstract, like smoke swirling in patterns I couldn't make sense of. But then, the smoke started to form bodies. Not people exactly, but shapes resembling them. They floated in the air around me, circling slowly like vultures. Their movements were deliberate, almost hypnotic, and then they stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. It was as if the whole world had paused, and just as suddenly as they had stopped, the shapes lunged toward me. I felt hands grabbing at me, cold, damp hands that felt like wet soil. They didn't hurt me, but their touch was enough to make me want to scream. I tried to cry out, but no sound came. My throat was locked, as if something was holding it shut. Then, for the first time, I heard them speak, not one voice, but many men, women, young, old. Their words echoed in my mind, not in the air around me. "Time to be cleaned," they said, over and over. "Time to be cleaned." Their voices weren't angry or kind. They were indifferent, detached, like they were reciting something they had said 1,000 times before. I wanted to scream, to ask them what they meant. But the words wouldn't come. All I could do was feel their grip tighten as they dragged me through the endless flashes of light. I wasn't walking. My feet weren't touching the ground. I was being pulled, weightless, towards something I couldn't see. The white flashes continued, and with each burst, I caught glimpses of their faces or where faces should have been. But there were no eyes, no mouths, no features at all, just smooth, blank surfaces. Still, I felt their gaze, like they could see right through me. They brought me to a room. At least, I think it was a room. I couldn't see the walls, but I could feel them, closing in on me. The ground was wet beneath my feet. I didn't know when they had let me go. But suddenly, I was standing. The air was thick and heavy, carrying a smell so foul it burned my nose. Sulfur, rust, and decay all mixed together. Then, the voices returned. Time to be cleaned. Before I could react, something cold was poured over me. It wasn't water. It was thicker, heavier, and it burned. First, it was icy cold, then scalding hot, and then it turned into a searing pain that felt like it was stripping away my skin. I tried to scream, but my voice was lost in the cacophony of whispers and hums. At that moment, I knew I wasn't in the world I knew anymore. And wherever I wasn't ready for what came next. The burning sensation didn't let up, not even for a moment. My skin felt like it was being peeled away layer by layer. But when I looked down, I was still whole. The pain wasn't just physical, it burrowed deeper, into something I couldn't touch. The voices that echoed around me never faltered, repeating their cryptic phrase like a chant. Time to be cleaned. Then, it stopped. The pain, the noise, the unbearable stench, all of it vanished in an instant. I opened my eyes and found myself standing in a vast, cavernous expanse. The air was heavy, thick with heat, and a crimson glow emanated from somewhere deep within the space. I looked around and realized there were no walls. Just endless darkness punctuated by fiery pillars rising high into an unseen ceiling. Far in the distance, I saw shapes moving, shadows, human-like but distorted. They wandered aimlessly, some collapsing to their knees, others clawing at the ground. Their cries were faint at first, but as I focused on them, the sounds grew louder, wails of despair, desperate pleas, whispered apologies. The agony in their voices made my stomach turn. I wanted to move, to walk away from the terrible scene in front of me, but my feet were rooted to the ground. That's when I felt it again, those hands. They were back, gripping me from behind, but this time they didn't pull me. Instead, they pointed. Look, the voices commanded. I turned my head and saw a circle of figures standing in the distance. They were draped in white hoods, their forms still as statues. My breath caught in my throat as I recognized the unmistakable shape of their attire. The hoods, the robes, they were the clan. The sight sent a chill through me. Despite the oppressive heat, I wanted to look away, but I couldn't. Something held my gaze, forcing me to confront them. As I stared, the figures began to move, slowly at first, then faster, circling a shadowy figure in the center. The figure was crouched low, its body trembling. I squinted, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. And then it hit me. The figure in the center was Samuel. Samuel, that name echoed in my mind like a thunderclap. Memories of him flooded back, unbidden and sharp. I saw him as he was when we were children. A boy with wide eyes and a quiet demeanor. He was my neighbor, my friend, or at least, he could have been, but I'd never allowed that. Not really. The first memory that came to me was of the day we met. We were both 10 years old, standing on the dirt road in front of our houses. I had a shiny new toy truck, a gift from my father, while Samuel played with a hand-carved wooden car. I remembered the way he looked at my truck, not with envy, but with quiet curiosity. And what had I done? I turned my back to him, clutching my truck tightly, thinking to myself, he'll never have something this nice. He doesn't deserve it. The memory shifted, and I was older, standing on the steps of the church. It was a Sunday morning, and I was surrounded by other members of my congregation. A black family passed by on the road, the mother cradling a crying baby. I could see her exhaustion, the sweat on her brow, the strain in her arms as she held the child close. And what had I done? Nothing. I glanced at them briefly, then turned away. joining in the quiet chuckles of the others. I hadn't said a word, but my silence had spoken volumes. The scenes came faster now, each one more damning than the last. I saw myself as a young woman, driving a tractor in the fields. Samuel walked by, carrying a heavy sack on his back. He was covered in dust, his shirt soaked with sweat. I had the chance to help him, to offer him a ride into town. But I didn't. Instead, I watched him disappear into the haze, telling myself it wasn't my responsibility. The weight of these memories pressed down on me like a physical force. I wanted to look away, to escape the images, but I couldn't. They were burned into my vision, replaying over and over. "Do you understand now?" the voices asked. I shook my head, tears streaming down my face. "I didn't mean to hurt anyone," I whispered. "I didn't do anything wrong." "That's the problem," the voices replied, their tone cold and unforgiving. "You did nothing." I collapsed to my knees, the ground beneath me rough and hot. The pain I felt now was different from before. It wasn't the burning of my skin or the cold grip of those hands. It was the pain of realizing that I had spent my life turning a blind eye to the suffering of others. My inaction, my indifference, it had hurt people in ways I could never take back. I looked up and saw Samuel again, but this time he wasn't the trembling figure in the center of the circle. He was standing right in front of me, his expression calm but stern. His presence was so real, so vivid, that I felt like I could reach out and touch him. "Why?" he asked, his voice quiet but heavy with emotion. "Why did you look away?" I couldn't answer. My throat felt like it was closing, and no words came to my lips. All I could do was bow my head and sob. Samuel didn't say anything else. He just stood there, his gaze piercing through me, as if he could see every dark corner of my soul. Then, the figures in white hoods began to chant. Their voices were low and guttural, rising and falling in a rhythm that made my skin crawl. The ground beneath me started to tremble, and cracks appeared, glowing with a fiery orange light. I looked down and saw my reflection in the molten surface, my face twisted with guilt and fear. The voices spoke again, louder this time. "Time to be cleaned." Before I could react, the ground beneath me gave way, and I was plunged into darkness. The darkness I fell into wasn't just absence, it was weight. Suffocating and thick, my arms flailed in the void, searching for something, anything to hold on to. But there was nothing, just an endless descent. Then, as suddenly as it had started, the fall stopped. I wasn't sure if I landed or if the darkness simply gave way. All I knew was that I was standing again, my legs trembling beneath me. The air here was different. It burned when I inhaled, hot and acrid like smoke from a fire, but denser, heavier. A dim crimson glow illuminated the space around me, casting long, flickering shadows on the jagged ground. The voices that had haunted me before were silent now, replaced by a low hum, almost like a heartbeat reverberating through the space. Ahead of me, a massive structure loomed. It was a cross, impossibly large, its wood blackened and smoldering as if it had been pulled from a fire. Chains hung from its beams, glowing faintly in the crimson light. My breath caught in my throat as I realized someone was bound to it. I stepped closer, each movement heavy, like wading through water. As I approached, the figure on the cross became clearer. It was a woman, her head hanging low, her arms stretched wide, and her feet nailed together. Her body bore the marks of countless wounds, blood trailing down her arms and legs. But it wasn't the injuries that froze me in place. It was her face. It was mine. I stumbled back, nearly falling to the ground. "No," I whispered, shaking my head. "That's not me. That can't be me." But it was. Every detail, the curve of her face, the lines around her eyes, the strands of gray in her hair, it was all mine. She lifted her head, and her eyes locked onto mine. They weren't angry or sad. They were empty, reflecting the weight of everything I had refused to see in myself. "What is this?" I demanded, my voice cracking. "Why are you showing me this?" A voice answered, not the many voices from before, but a single one, deep, resonant, and calm. "This is who you are." "No," I protested, shaking my head again. "I'm not like this. I didn't hurt anyone. I didn't." "Didn't you?" the voice interrupted, cutting through my denial like a knife. "Every time you turned away, every time you stayed silent, You chose this. The woman on the cross, my reflection, spoke now. Her voice was weak, but it echoed all around me. How many times did you look away when someone needed you? How many times did you tell yourself it wasn't your problem? Images flooded my mind, unbidden and relentless. I saw Samuel again, walking down the dusty road with that heavy sack on his back. I saw the Black family passing the church, the mother's tired eyes pleading for kindness that never came. I saw the countless faces I had ignored over the years, people who had crossed my path but whom I had dismissed as unimportant. Each memory hit me like a physical blow. I fell to my knees, clutching my chest as if the weight of it all might crush me. I didn't know, I whispered, tears streaming down my face. I didn't know it mattered. You knew, the voice replied, cold and certain. You just didn't care. The figure on the cross, the version of myself I could no longer deny, spoke again. You told yourself you were better. You told yourself it wasn't your job to help. And when you saw their pain, you looked away. I couldn't argue. The memories wouldn't let me. They played over and over in my mind, each one a testament to my apathy, my complicity. The pain of it was unbearable, not because of what others had done to me, but because of what I had done or failed to do. Please, I begged, my voice hoarse. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. The voice responded, softer now but still firm. Being sorry is not enough. The ground beneath me began to tremble, and the air grew hotter. The chains on the cross rattled, and the glow around them intensified. I looked up at my reflection, her eyes still locked on mine. For the first time, I saw a flicker of something in them, understanding, perhaps, or forgiveness. You must change, she said, her voice faint but resolute, or this is where you will remain. The chains around her wrists and ankles began to loosen, falling away one by one. As they hit the ground, they dissolved into ash, carried away by an unseen wind. The glow around the cross dimmed, and the figure began to fade. I reached out, desperate to hold on to her, to hold on to whatever lesson she was trying to impart. But before I could touch her, she was gone. The cross remained, charred and empty, a stark reminder of what I had seen. The voice spoke one final time. You have seen the truth. Now you must decide what to do with it. The crimson glow around me began to fade, replaced by a soft, steady white light. It wasn't blinding like before. It was warm, gentle, like the first rays of sunlight after a long, dark night. I felt my body being lifted, weightless once more, but this time there was no fear, only a sense of quiet resolution. The warmth of the white light was the first thing I noticed when I woke. It wasn't harsh like the flashes I'd seen before. This light was steady, flickering slightly, and I realized it wasn't a vision, it was a hospital ceiling light. My body felt heavy, weighted down by something more than just the wires and tubes I could feel attached to me. My throat was dry, and breathing was labored, each inhale dragging air through the oxygen tube in my nose. I blinked slowly, my mind sluggish but beginning to piece itself together. The memories of what I had seen in that other place hit me like a tidal wave. The visions, the voices, the cross, it all came flooding back, vivid and undeniable. My chest tightened with the weight of it, and tears welled up in my eyes. I turned my head to look out the window. The sun was shining, its light reflecting off the glass, casting patterns on the walls. It was so bright, yet it didn't feel harsh. It felt alive. I don't know how long I stared at that sunlight, but as I did, I felt something stir within me, a realization that I was still here, still breathing, still alive. And with that realization came something else. Shame. It wasn't the kind of shame you feel when you've been caught doing something wrong. This was deeper. It was the kind of shame that comes from seeing yourself for who you really are, stripped of all excuses and justifications. The voices from that other place echoed in my mind. You must change, or this is where you will remain. A nurse entered the room, her expression warm but cautious. You're awake, she said, her voice gentle. You've been through a lot. I nodded weakly, my throat too dry to speak. She checked my vitals, her movements efficient but kind, and then left the room, giving me time to gather myself. As I lay there, staring at the sunlight, I knew what I had to do. The day I left the hospital, the sun was blindingly bright. I stepped outside slowly, my legs unsteady, but I didn't shield my eyes. I let the light wash over me, feeling its warmth on my skin. It was as if I were seeing the world for the first time, not just seeing it, but truly noticing it. I went home, but the house felt different, almost foreign. Everything about it reminded me of who I had been, of the life I had lived before the accident. The pictures on the walls, the books on the shelves, even the way the furniture was arranged, it all seemed to belong to someone else. Someone I didn't want to be anymore. For days, I struggled with what to do next. The memories of that other place haunted me, but they also gave me clarity. I couldn't ignore the truth I had been shown. I had to face it. I had to start with the one person who had been at the center of so many of those memories, Samuel. It had been years since I had spoken to him. Decades, really. Our lives had drifted apart, not because of any argument or falling out, but because of the quiet distance I had allowed to grow between us. I had told myself it was just the way things were, but now I saw the truth. That distance wasn't inevitable, it was a choice. My choice. One evening, just as the sun was beginning to set, I stood in front of Samuel's door. My knees felt weak, and my hands trembled as I raised them to knock. A part of me wanted to turn back, to tell myself that it wasn't necessary, that it wouldn't change anything. But the voices from that other place echoed in my mind. You must change. I knocked. The sound of it was heavier than it should have been. Like the echo carried the weight of everything I had left unsaid for so many years. I held my breath, praying silently that he would answer. And then the door opened. Samuel stood there, his face older but familiar. His eyes locked onto mine. And for a moment, neither of us spoke. I saw recognition in his expression, but also curiosity. He tilted his head slightly, as if to say, "What are you doing here?" "Samuel," I began, my voice cracking. I cleared my throat, trying to steady myself. "I need to say something to you." He didn't respond, but he didn't close the door either. That small gesture of openness gave me the courage to continue. "I've spent years ignoring things," I said, the words tumbling out of me. "Not just you, but others too, and myself. I've told myself it didn't matter, that I wasn't responsible, but that's not true. I was wrong." I paused, swallowing hard. "I'm sorry, Samuel, for all of it, for the things I did, and the things I didn't do." For a long moment, he didn't move. He just stood there, watching me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Then, slowly, he stepped forward and placed his hand on my shoulder. It was such a small gesture, but it carried a weight I hadn't expected. It wasn't just forgiveness, it was acceptance. "Come inside, Beryl," he said quietly. I hesitated for only a moment before stepping through the door. That step felt heavier than anything I'd ever done before, but it also felt right. For the first time, I crossed that threshold not as the person I had been, but as someone who was trying to be better. From that day on, I began to change. It wasn't easy. Each morning, I stood in front of the mirror, looking at the face that had haunted me in that other place. But I didn't look away. I faced it. Every day, I reminded myself of the promise I had made to Samuel, to myself, to the world. Some people noticed the change in me. A few even asked, "What happened to you, Beryl?" But I never gave them the full answer. It wasn't something I could explain in words. It was something I had to live. Others were skeptical, even critical. "You've changed," they'd say, their tone implying it wasn't a compliment. And they were right. I had changed, but for the first time in my life, I knew that change was what I needed. Change is an unrelenting process. It starts with a single step, but every step after that feels like you're walking uphill through thick mud. That's how it was for me after the day I stood on Samuel's porch. My heart in my throat, apologizing for years of silence. Saying sorry was only the beginning. Living differently was the real challenge. I began each morning with a ritual, standing in front of the mirror and forcing myself to look. Really look, not at the lines on my face or the strands of gray in my hair, but at the person behind them, the woman who had spent most of her life looking away. For years, I had avoided my own reflection, afraid of what I might see. But now, I faced it. Every morning, I stared into that mirror and reminded myself, today, I will be better. Some days were harder than others. Old habits die slow and painful deaths. I caught myself slipping into the familiar rhythm of indifference more than once. A glance past someone struggling. An instinct to shrug and think, it's not my problem. But then I'd hear the voices from that other place. You must change. Or this is where you will remain. Those words haunted me, but they also kept me grounded. A constant reminder of what was at stake. One morning, I was working in my fields under a blazing sun. The air was thick with heat, and the tractor rumbled beneath me as I moved across the rows of crops. The steady hum of the engine had always been a source of comfort. A kind of meditative rhythm that let me drift into my thoughts. But that day, something caught my eye, a figure walking along the road that ran beside my property. I squinted against the sunlight, my hand shading my eyes. It was a man, his shirt dusty and worn, a heavy sack slung over his back. His steps were slow, his shoulders slumped under the weight of his load. For a moment, the sight froze me in place. It was as if time had rewound itself, and I was looking at Samuel again, walking down that same road with his own heavy sack. The memory hit me like a blow to the chest. I remembered how I had watched him from the tractor all those years ago, doing nothing as he struggled under the weight. My younger self hadn't even considered stopping to help. But this time, there was no hesitation. I turned off the tractor, climbed down, and walked toward the man. My boots crunched against the dirt road as I approached, the sound seeming louder than it should have been. The man stopped when he saw me, his face wary but curious. I raised a hand in a small wave, forcing myself to smile. "Hey there," I called out, my voice steady despite the nervousness in my chest. "You headed somewhere?" He looked at me for a long moment, then nodded. "Town," he said simply, his voice rough, as if he hadn't spoken much that day. "Let me give you a ride," I said, motioning toward my truck parked nearby. For a second, he hesitated. I could see the doubt in his eyes, the question of whether or not to trust me. But eventually, he nodded again and set the sack down at his feet. I picked it up for him, surprised by its weight but not letting it show. Together, we walked to the truck, and I helped him load the sack into the bed. The drive to town was quiet at first. He sat with his hands folded in his lap, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. But as the minutes passed, we began to talk. His name was Thomas, and he had been walking for miles to reach a job site where he hoped to find work. He didn't complain about the distance or the heat. He spoke with quiet determination, his voice steady despite the weariness I could see in his face. When we reached his destination, Thomas turned to me before climbing out of the truck. "Thank you," he said, his tone earnest. "God bless you." I nodded, unable to speak past the lump in my throat. As I watched him walk away, I felt something shift inside me, a lightness I hadn't known in years. It was as if a small piece of the weight I had carried for so long had lifted. Just a little. Moments like that became more frequent as time went on. I began to notice opportunities to help where I once would have looked away. Sometimes they were big moments, like giving someone a ride or lending a hand with a heavy task. Other times, they were small. A kind word, a genuine smile, a simple acknowledgement of someone's presence. Each act, no matter how small, felt like another step forward, another step away from the person I had been. But not everyone understood the changes in me. Some of my old friends would shake their heads and say, "You've gone soft, Beryl, you're not the same." They said it like it was a bad thing, as if change were a weakness. But I didn't argue with them. They were right, I wasn't the same, and I didn't want to be. Silence and indifference had once been my shield, my way of avoiding conflict and responsibility. But I had come to understand that silence wasn't strength. It was cowardice, and I refused to live that way any longer. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of gold and pink, I sat on my porch, reflecting on everything that had happened. The memories of that other place were still vivid, but they didn't haunt me the way they once did. Instead, they served as a guide, a reminder of the promise I had made to live differently. I thought about Samuel often. We didn't speak every day, but there was a quiet understanding between us now, an unspoken connection forged in forgiveness and redemption. That connection meant more to me than words could ever express. As I stared out at the fields, I whispered a simple prayer: "God bless you all." It wasn't just for me or for the people I had wronged. It was for everyone, for those I had ignored, for those still struggling, and for those walking their own paths toward redemption. That night, as I lay in bed, I felt a peace I hadn't known in years. I knew I wasn't perfect, and I never would be. But I was trying. Every day, I was trying, and that, I realized, was what mattered most. If you believe in God and near-death experiences, subscribe to Life at NDE today. Discover inspiring messages from God through powerful near-death stories that bring hope and understanding. Hit subscribe now and join us in spreading the light of faith.